Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar hosted by the American Public Human Services Association, also known as APHSA, in partnership with AidKit. Today's webinar topic is what human services leaders can learn from emergency managers. Next slide, please. So my name is Francesca Robinson. I'm an instructional designer with APHSA, and I'd love to take just a few minutes to share with you about who we are and the work we're proud to do alongside of our members. So at APHSA, we represent human services agencies at the state, county, and city levels from across the country. We're a bipartisan organization dedicated to building common ground and generating practical solutions that work for people and communities. Next slide, please. So we aim to advance the well-being of individuals, families, and communities through three core channels. So those would be influencing modern approaches to sound policy, building the capacity of public agencies, and also connecting leaders to accelerate learning and generate practical solutions. So our vision is one of thriving communities built on human potential. Next slide. So while we're on the topic of being connected, I want to let everyone know about the APHSA conferences that we are hosting in 2026. We've got a few coming up in New Orleans, Louisiana, Spokane, Washington, and Salt Lake City, Utah. You can visit the events page at aphsa.org throughout the year to learn more about these conferences, including when you can register, keynote speakers, and the different session topics. Next slide. So lastly, APHSA also offers a Career Center, which is a dedicated job board and talent marketplace designed specifically to connect professionals with career opportunities across the human services sector. It serves as a valuable resource for individuals seeking new roles, advancing their careers, or exploring opportunities within the sector. So definitely check that out if you're interested. And then before I turn it over to the presenters for today, just a couple of housekeeping items. So as you've noticed, this webinar is being recorded and it'll be circulated shortly after the event to anyone who registered. And then during this webinar, you might have also seen that the chat is disabled. We are requesting that you put any questions for our presenters in the Q&A panel. So you'll see that at the bottom of your screen. Our panelists will try to type responses to as many as possible live, but they'll also have time for Q&A throughout the presentation. So with all of that said, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Jamie.
Good afternoon and good morning to everyone joining from wherever you may be joining from. We are super excited to be here today. And first and foremost, thank you to APHSA for partnering with us on this webinar. We're going to be diving into an exciting topic today of what human service leaders and emergency managers can really learn from each other and what it takes to build systems that hold up when disruption hits. And you will be hearing from the wonderful Deanne Criswell and Brittany Christenson on that. Next slide, please. To kick us off, just want to give you a little overview of who you will be hearing from. I'll intro myself quickly. I'm Jamie Hackbarth. I'm a senior manager here at AidKit, which you'll learn more throughout this conversation on, but previously have served in various public sector roles with the state of Colorado and at the federal level with Department of Commerce and Energy as well. But very excited to introduce the people you're here to hear from. First and foremost, Deanne Criswell. She served as a former FEMA Administrator from 2021 to 2025, where she oversaw everything from national disaster preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation during a period of record-breaking disasters. And her career really spans local, state, and national leadership, where she served as the emergency manager for Aurora, Colorado, the commissioner of New York City Emergency Management, and at the Colorado Air National Guard as well. And she's really known for bridging gaps in disaster response across agencies. So wonderful person to have here today for this conversation. And then also happy to introduce my very own boss, our CEO of AidKit, Brittany Christenson. During her leadership here at AidKit, she has helped distribute over $450 million of relief across 27 states. And she's an expert at the intersection of technology, public policy, and human services, and really on helping organizations and public sector agencies modernize how they deliver cash assistance, disaster relief, and public benefits. So with that, to get us started on the next slide, I want Brittany to give a little bit of more of an overview of who AidKit is, and then we'll dive into the conversation from there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jamie. And thank you to Deanne and APHSA. We're really excited to be here today. And I've been looking at the attendee list and I see some friends in the chat. So it's really good to see everybody, or at least be here with you, even though there's this weird wall between us in the webinar. But please ask questions. We're excited to engage with you. If AidKit, if you haven't heard of us, is a public benefit corporation and certified B Corp, and we're on a mission to deliver aid with dignity. We work with nonprofits and government agencies, and our focus is really helping to distribute cash assistance, whether that's during a disaster event, whether that's during an emergency, or there's program innovation and you want to try something new. So we've worked with about 240 different state and local partners, as well as major nonprofits across the U.S., and we support basically the best innovators in this country. So we're really, really grateful for the role that we play in the sector and the front row seat that we have to some of the incredible human services work that's happening. I'd also say that AidKit is really focused on helping serve the people in a community who are most likely to be left behind. So while we're a tech company, our real secret sauce is being able to bring our expertise to bear from all of the programs we've helped run and really hold our partners' hands through some of the most challenging crises and moments of public service that they face. So I'll stop there and turn it back to Jamie.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brittany. And we're going to go on to the next slide. We would love to hear from you all first, actually, through a poll. So we're going to go ahead and prompt that poll here shortly, which you should see pop up on your screen. And if you have any trouble clicking with it, you should get the QR code. But the question we have for you to start is, if a major disruption hit tomorrow, would your agency be able to identify who needs help and reach them quickly? So we have over 100 of you folks on the line, and we'll give it about half a minute or so for you all to click your yes, not right away, maybe, or no, and we'll report out. I'm going to go ahead and share the results. So it seems like we're kind of split across the thirds, of a third of folks really saying, yes, we've built for this. The other third saying not right away, but we'd figure it out. The other third, maybe, but there are real gaps. And some folks too also saying, no, we currently don't have any infrastructure to this, which across the board, we're kind of going to dive into what this looks like from no matter where you are on that spectrum. And hopefully you'll walk away with some tangible ideas and action items to help during disruption. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our conversation. If we could go to the next slide. So as many of you may know, there's been a shift in the landscape across the past year, impacting both emergency response and you all as human service leaders. So some of you may be aware that the FEMA Review Council came out with some recommendations, which may be impacting your own work or your partner's work. And we wanted to start out by addressing that as we have Deanne here. And Deanne, when you were the FEMA administrator, you had a front row seat to how state and local agencies responded when disruption hit. And that proximity means you probably have some pretty strong insights on what's changing. So to kick us off, can you share your perspective on the FEMA Review Council's recommendations and what that means for state and local human service leaders?
Thanks, Jamie. And hello, everybody. Really excited to be able to be here. I have read the FEMA Review Council report, and there's a lot of different recommendations that are in there. And I would say that, some of those recommendations are new ways of trying to implement programs, but many of those recommendations are also things that we've been trying to get across the board for years, right? And one of the challenges with trying to get some of these new recommendations through is the process that it takes to get them done. And so I guess I would start by saying, while there's a lot of perhaps angst about some of the changes that are in there. Just know that those are only recommendations. What we have not seen yet is which ones that they are going to adopt, and know that even those that they choose to adopt, some can be done by policy, but many of them may require regulation or statutory change, which can take time. And so what I don't think is going to happen is very quick, abrupt changes that are going to impact you. But as we start to see some of the efforts that they're going to put forward, we want to pay attention to those that they're really putting focus on, because they will have an impact over time. I think the other thing that I really want to talk about on this is there's been a lot of conversation with this FEMA Review Council about pushing responsibility back down to the state and locals. And I think it's important to recognize that that has always been in place, right? The responsibility to take care of people in our communities lies with the state and the local emergency manager, health and human services, right? That is your day-to-day job. And the federal government only comes in when asked to come in. And so the responsibility isn't shifting. What I would argue is that what we might see is the risk is shifting, right? And where the federal government takes a very sometimes laborious approach to, confirming expenses project by project, which can take time, and pushing that down to state and locals. And what that does is that changes the risk, right? The federal government right now has the risk of making sure that funding is being used appropriately. And that's why they take the time to ensure that they're checking all of the reimbursement requests that are coming in to make sure they meet federal guidelines. If the money is pushed out quicker, yes, you'll be able to use it quicker, but you also own that risk now. And so that's one of the things that I think is important to remember, that's changing. But I think as we think about how this impacts our health and human service agencies, there's a lot of recommendations in there about individual assistance. And some of those recommendations are about giving more money to the individual, which can help you in some of your planning about how you're going to have to support people after a disaster happens. But some of the recommendations are also in there about shifting some of the ownership of the temporary housing back to a state and local earlier, right? Instead of the federal government staying involved for months, if not years. And so that's an important one for everybody to watch and make sure that you're understanding the direction that FEMA is going, because that will have an impact on you. And I think one of the things that I would recommend that everybody do now is understand after a major incident hits you, have you done an assessment of where you rely on the federal government to assist in helping the people that have been displaced, or the people that have lost their jobs, the people that need additional food benefits? Do you know where you rely on the federal government? And have you started the planning for what happens when the federal government isn't going to be able to support that? Whether that's through the changes that are being recommended within the Review Council report, or the fact that they're changing some of the threshold levels to even reach a declaration, right? And so we may not see as many declarations perhaps as we've seen in the past. And so I wouldn't wait, right? The thing isn't about waiting to see what they're going to do. The thing is about making sure you have solid programs, you have a good understanding of what your dependencies are, or where you can do things on your own, and start the planning for if that shift happens, if that change happens. Do you have the technology in place to be able to deliver the programs at a bigger scale? Do you have the capacity in place, the personnel to reach out and implement these programs? Or do you have the resources, right? Do you have the funding and the logistics needed to help, right? Those are the kind of analysis and assessments that I think you can be doing today to be prepared for whatever future changes might happen coming down the road.
It's incredibly helpful, Deanne, and I think goes into the next piece very naturally of when you're doing that assessment, do you also have the right partnerships in place as well with other local or state agencies at the emergency level? Can we go to the next slide, please? And that goes into the next question, which, Brittany, I want to bring you in here as you worked with various partners during disaster response and recovery. And really, what would you say that human service leaders can learn from emergency managers if they're looking at building that partnership, whether at the beginning or deepening it if they already have that as well?
Yeah, this is a great question. So emergency managers have really spent decades, their whole careers in some cases, mastering coordination, logistics, and preparedness. And They are flexible generalists. They are emergency managers generally are ready for whatever may happen because they know that they can build new relationships. They can pull in different resources, and they're kind of trained to think best on the fly. And I think one of the really cool opportunities for the human services folks to learn from emergency managers, and not that you all don't have those same skills as well, but in terms of making generalizations, the HHS work tends to be work that's more structured around long-term programming. And human service leaders bring the most incredible deep knowledge of their actual communities. Who lives in your community? Who needs help? What are the vulnerable areas? How do you best serve those communities? As well as community relationships and partnerships. HHS is often working with large networks of community-based organizations on the ground, family resource centers. And so when you bring those strengths together, when you have the folks who know the community and know what the community needs and serves the community on a daily basis with the folks who are adaptable and are used to having to think on the fly and bring in completely new programs, really powerful things are possible.
Absolutely. And Deanne, I remember from our call before this, you shared about, I feel like a great example that puts that into an illustrative concept in real life about the New York air conditioning story. Would you be able to share a little bit more about that, as I feel like it touches on the value of the relationship of emergency managers and human services, that there's value on both and they need each other?
Yeah, absolutely, Jamie. I think, the point that Brittany made is really important, right? You have the health and human services, agencies have all of that data already of who the vulnerable populations are. And often what I see is that we see emergency management organizations that are trying to develop a list, right? An opt-in list of when they need additional help. And sometimes they're working together with their health and human service partners. And that's when you have the best results. But oftentimes they're doing it in a silo. And I think that partnership is really important. And where it really showed true for me is when I served as the commissioner of New York City Emergency Management. So I'll take everybody back to the hardest year of my life, which was 2020, and being the commissioner of emergency management in New York City, planning for COVID, and then responding to COVID, and then trying to understand all of the cascading impacts as a result of COVID. And one of those cascading impacts was, as we were moving into summer, the forecast was going to be that it was going to be a very hot summer. And one of the traditional tools that we used was to open up cooling centers where people could go if they didn't have air conditioning, because I learned while I was there that quite a large number of the population in New York City does not have air conditioning. And so how do we find ways for them to get cool? And one of the ways is these congregate centers. Another way is just going to places that are already cool, which all of you know, right? Going to shopping malls, going into movie theaters, going into libraries or museums. But the challenge during COVID is the people that typically need these types of services the most are the most vulnerable. And what we didn't want to do is put our most vulnerable communities in a congregate setting, because they are also the most vulnerable to catch this virus. And so we had to come up with a unique way that we could try to meet the reality of people needing to have this cooling service, but not exposing them to the virus. And so we worked very closely with the mayor's team and folks across the city to develop this air conditioner program. And the mayor had directed us to install 75,000 air conditioners to the most vulnerable people across New York City. And so we started that process by reaching out to our human services agencies and getting that data, right? They had the data. As Brittany mentioned, you have all of that data, and they gave us the priority list to help us determine who those 75,000 people were going to be and prioritize them. How do we make that decision out of 8.9 or 8.5 million residents in New York City? How am I going to decide which 75,000 are going to get air conditioners? And so it was that data and that partnership with our human services agencies that helped us define that number, define that population. And then from there, New York City Emergency Management dealt with the logistics of it, purchasing of the the air conditioners, the logistics of installing, hiring contractors to be able to go out and install these, and hiring vehicles that could move them around, or using our own staff. So all of the logistical pieces and the operational pieces came from within New York City Emergency Management. But then finally, it wasn't going to do any good if people wouldn't use it because they couldn't afford their electric bill. And so we worked with the state to then offer subsidies so people would actually utilize the air conditioners and we could keep people safe. And in the end, we did install, believe it or not, 75,000 air conditioners right before the peak of summer hit. It was a record summer for temperatures, and we were able to provide that value and keep people that were vulnerable to a COVID-19 virus safe in their homes, but cool, and so they wouldn't be impacted by the excessive heat that we were experiencing across New York City. So I think it's just a really great example of how that partnership of helping people, where you know who's the most vulnerable, emergency management knows how to do the logistics and the operations, bringing in other partners to help execute this really can have a value add for the community. And these are the kind of conversations that I think we could do more of before a disaster happens. And so we're ready to be able to respond more quickly when it does.
Exactly. No, I feel like that illustrates perfectly that a partnership is really only good. It's measured at the moment of disruption, and being able to call on those people, those different agencies, and it's not any one agency's role, but really a coordinated effort when crisis hits. So that's very, very helpful. I feel like, at least for me, to see it and hear it in practice. If we go to the next slide, I want to dive a bit deeper into what this could actually look like, of who should be at the table and the why of why we should address this, and what we may actually need to address this, and how do we actually get relief into people's hands when they need it most. So Brittany, I want to start with you, as you have overseen a lot of emergency management programs and practice with AidKit as the technology backbone behind it. So I want to start by looking at really what are the common gaps you've seen when it comes to responding and delivering aid and relief when disruption or a disaster hits, and what are some of those solutions to counteract those gaps?
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. So I think something that human services leaders like yourselves are most familiar with is that a lot of the systems that are used day to day to administer the ongoing programs that you run may not be flexible for introducing new eligibility criteria or new program applications on the fly in the case of a crisis. And so one of the biggest things that you can really do to help kind of set things up is to have a system that can allow you to act more nimbly, but also something that's safe and compliant, which is incredibly hard to build on the fly. So one of the ways that we've been really successful in helping our partners in state and local government is by working together to work with braided funding sources and have a plan in advance. So as we all know, when a disruption or a disaster occurs, you see philanthropy come in first, usually first dollars in, and then there's usually some county money if you're lucky, followed by state. And then if you get a disaster declaration, it'll take some time, but you can also get the federal help if the declaration is declared. We find that where some of the systems break down is when you don't have a good way to segment those different funding sources, because we all know that the reporting requirements to different funders can be pretty challenging, and complying with an audit is also intimidating if you don't have a system that's really designed for the eligibility criteria that you've created. Now, in the past, working with large consulting firms to build custom systems, or hiring consultants that can configure a system for you on the fly and help operate it, has been the status quo. But there are now, technology solutions that are able to help you work with your community in advance of an event to really map out where the most vulnerable people are, and then be ready to act when a disruption comes. Because I'm sure at this point, having led through maybe the pandemic or a disaster, the SNAP gap that happened last year, I'm sure all of you are no strangers to standing up programs on the fly. And you know that it can be really, really challenging if you're not able to be proactive. The other thing that I'm sure you've experienced is that unlike more of the entitlement programs or long-term steady state programs, these disruption programs often have funding that's finite. So you're going to have more need in your community than you have resources to fill those needs. And that creates a very different kind of architecture for a program. So instead of, first come, first serve to hand out the resources, what you're going to need to do is map out your community's needs and then create eligibility criteria for the funds that will be fair. And you always want to have a larger eligible population than the funds you have available. And then you need to randomize it and to prioritize the way the funds are distributed so that those individuals in your community who are most in need get the help. So we've worked with our partners in government to create prioritization matrices so that when you're getting that flood of applications coming in the door, not only does it filter out the duplicates and the fraudulent applications, but it also helps you see where individuals are in the community and how much in need they are, so that you can go through and you can review those applications or get support from an outside vendor, community partner, and you know that you're really maximizing the impact because you're hitting those prioritized groups first, whether that's unhoused communities, families with small children. Oftentimes we see prioritization around brick and mortar locations, whether that's homes or businesses that have been kind of directly impacted or a total loss from the disaster. And so, that's an area that I think can be a little bit different, but having the system set up in advance to be able to do that eligibility customization and that prioritization really makes all the difference. And the last thing that I'll say is that one of the challenges that we see also is politics get involved, right? When you're running these programs, your board of supervisors or for the county level especially, there may be political involvement where, how the funds are distributed is just under so much scrutiny. And that creates a lot of pressure for the program administrators. And we've found that simply having really strong data and reporting so that you can create a dashboard to show the other stakeholders in your community, the other leaders, the politicians, it can just make all the difference in everyone having confidence that the limited funds available to serve the community are being leveraged in the best way possible. So those are some of the learnings that we've had with our partners over the last several years.
Thank you, Brittany. Super helpful. And as you can see here on this slide, I feel like it gives voice as well to what Deanne was saying earlier of where to start evaluating that readiness as well. And Deanne, want to come back to you. If you were a human services director right now today, what would you be doing in the next 90 days to be able to have your current operating model hold up under stress during a disaster?
Jamie, I think, the first thing is if you don't have that relationship already with your emergency manager, you need to introduce yourself, right? Because it's that partnership of being able to come together before a disaster and learn how you can each support each other is going to make a big difference. If you have that relationship already, then let's start having the conversation, the more detailed conversation about, okay, where can the work that we're doing as human services agencies scale, or where can it not scale? As I talked about earlier about trying to assess our systems. Do we have the right technology in place? Do we have the right capacity in place? And where can we support each other to quickly get out resources, get out assistance to people that have been impacted by disaster. What I have seen over and over is where the human services agencies and the emergency managers have done all of this work ahead of time. It really helps speed that road to recovery. It helps jumpstart it faster, and we can get people not just the resources that they need, which is really important, but it gives them the confidence that their government entity is there to help them, right? And so when you can react quickly, coming together, that makes a big difference in their understanding of how they're going to be able to be helped by their government. And I think the thing from the emergency management standpoint, one of the things that emergency managers are so good at is then also bringing in other people to the table, right? They are not experts in human services. They are not experts in firefighting. What they are experts at is collaborating and bringing the right people together. And so these kind of conversations that happen ahead of a disaster, ahead of a disruption, is not just about you and the emergency manager, but who else needs to be in that conversation based on the problem that you're trying to solve. And so that's what I would do over the next 90 days is introduce yourself to the emergency manager and build a relationship if you don't have one. Begin doing that assessment of where can you scale, where can you not scale, and then how many other people need to be at the table to solve the problems that we are going to be facing in our community, the problems that you face each and every day that are just exasperated when something happens.
Super helpful action plan and steps, I feel like to just walk away with right there, Deanne. So with that, want to dive into what does this actually look like in practice? We already heard about the New York City air conditioning example, but on to the next slide, we'll see some other case studies that, Brittany, I would love you to share about, where AidKit has partnered with in real life disasters and disruptions over the past years.
Yeah, so I think everyone is aware of the devastating wildfires and windstorms that hit LA in January of 2025. AidKit had the honor of working with the county to be able to stand up some emergency cash assistance programming for workers as well as for small businesses and organizations that were impacted. And as we all know, there's that moment of disruption and everything that you need to do for that immediate response, but then there's also the long-term recovery. So our partnership with LA County has really grown and blossomed because we launched this initial set of 2 programs about 2 weeks after the wildfires and windstorms hit. So it was very fast. But after that initial launch, we were able to launch several rounds of subsequent funding that were prioritizing other populations in the community, because you never know the full impact of a disruption in advance. Really, when you start to understand the true impact is when you have those applications open and you begin to gather data from the community. The people will tell you where the impacts are. And so after the initial launch, the county decided to open up additional kind of adjacent funds. And with each adjacent fund, we were able to move more and more and more quickly and leverage the data from the previous rounds. And I think that made all the difference in having a really successful launch for those programs. We were able to provide the data about the immense needs facing the populations that were being targeted for these programs. And that helped increase the fundraising from philanthropic, local, and state funding sources from about $2 million in initial investment to well over $20 million by the time the program was said and done. And really, at the end of the day, we all were able to feel really good about who received the funds, knowing that it was those workers and those small businesses that were most impacted. So that's what I'll say on LA County. I'm really grateful for our partners in LA. And then I want to highlight also a partnership that we have with Save the Children. And they respond sometimes in partnership with government entities as well. But they were one of our early clients for our AidKit Ready product, which is a completely pre-configured software solution for responding to disasters. So we were able to sit down with them when the skies were blue and plan out how, in an ideal world, we would be able to serve children that were impacted by disasters and disruptions. And that was eye-opening for our team. We were able to get to our fastest launch times ever. So less than 4 hours for our record launch with Save the Children for responding together. And just last year, in just a 4-month time span, we helped them serve 4,000 families and around 10,000 children across 22 different states. And you wouldn't believe how how much the administrative burden dropped for them and for us, because that preparedness just went so far. And now we're working with additional partners, both in government and in nonprofit, to set up a few different segments. So you can have a disaster program that's ready to go for cash assistance for individuals. You can have one that's specifically targeted at early childhood educators and the families they serve, also housing assistance. So we can really get specific and set up systems so that when the eventual crisis happens, and it always comes eventually, you know what you're going to do and how you're going to serve your community.
Thank you so much, Brittany. And I did put the links to both of these case studies to one of the questions within the Q&A, if you want to check those out as well. And I think it just gives light to really the power of pre-positioning and being ready to be able to respond in under 4 hours once a disaster hits is truly sometimes unbelievable. But it is in this case, which is so great. And hopefully that does become more of the norm as well. So Deanne, I'd love to hear more from your experience of any other examples that come to mind of great partnerships, maybe what you've seen in jurisdictions that have been able to respond quickly or that were easier to work with, or anything that comes to mind.
Well, there could be a lot of examples there. I think, I just want to start with, piggybacking on one of the things that you just said about, having things in place ahead of time and pre-positioning. And one of the things that I think is a best practice is when we talk about pre-positioning, we're not just talking about pre-positioning resources, but we should also be talking about pre-positioning our capabilities or our contracts, right? I can go back to, again, my time at New York City Emergency Management, where we had a whole series of pre-positioned contracts that were ready to execute in case something happened. And we used that during COVID-19, a number of them, because contracting takes time. And when you're going to look for federal reimbursement, you have to make sure you follow all of those guidelines. So the more that you can do that ahead of time and have those tools and those contracts in place, like Brittany said, really saves you time in the end. And the one thing I have talked a lot about during my entire career is that time is our most precious commodity. And when we're talking about disaster response, those hours, days, weeks, they make a big difference in how fast a person is going to recover. And so that work that you can do ahead of time really, really makes a big difference. I think one of the other, examples, for some specific examples, I think about my time in Florida working, with the state emergency manager there. And they had put in place their own foundation after Hurricane Ian, I believe it was, because they wanted to have the ability to get some of these philanthropic dollars out faster, right? And so we partnered with them to help get there. We as FEMA partnered with them to help get the status for that set up so they could use that themselves to be able to get some of this funding out there, right? And so thinking through ahead of time, how would you get this funding out there when after a disaster you're going to get additional resources? I think, another just very tactical example is something as simple as DSNAP, right? Where that's going to be an additional program that's going to become available after a disaster happens. Where it works really well is when communities have worked together with their emergency managers ahead of time. So when a disaster recovery center is set up, it's not going to impede on what that operation needs at the disaster recovery center. And you don't have long lines of people that are in line for just one benefit like DSNAP, but then you have people that are also looking to register. And so that work that can be done ahead of time, which I have seen in a number of different communities where they know they've thought through the logistics, they've thought through the facilities, they've thought through the staffing. I've seen that after the wildfires here in Colorado from the Marshall Fire. They thought through that. They knew exactly where to put different things. So you didn't have people standing in one line thinking they were going to get one resource and then finding out that they needed to stand in another line. Another great example of a partnership doesn't necessarily apply here, but I think it's a good example of a partnership with the private sector is, again, I think it comes back from the Marshall Fire, where in Colorado, they created an insurance village because insurance is a big part of an individual's recovery. And so they created this insurance village in a location in a parking lot close to their disaster recovery center because they need that information. And so this way, the individual that was impacted could go to their insurance company. They brought in all of the private insurance agencies to stand up their operation out there, get their information, and then they could go apply for any additional state or federal assistance. And so it was a really great partnership about helping people just have one spot that they needed to go to, bringing services to them instead of making them figure out how to navigate the complexities and the multiple different avenues that they're going to have to go in order to navigate their recovery journey.
I love that, Deanne. I always say, how can we make it as easy for the person applying as possible? And I think that's a great example of it. And then on the side of the human service leaders, how can you make it easy for yourself as well if you plan ahead of time too? And I think all those examples really bring that into light. So before we hop into our next poll, I do want to encourage people to please put any questions or thoughts you have in the Q&A. Again, we have the chat disabled, but the Q&A should show at the bottom of your tool. And we do really want to hear from you. As right after the next poll, we'll hop into the Q&A section. So please put them in. Don't be shy. If you are, you could, I believe, submit a question in anonymous as well. So with that, we'll go on to the next slide and our next poll. So we want to hear from you again, in addition to the questions. So when disaster disruption hits, what role do you think your agency should play in providing direct financial relief? Whether before everything you heard, or if you're still kind of going through the nuggets of what you heard, what's really the role you see a human service agency as yourself during a disruption? Almost at about a third across these answers. So about 43% said they should lead to run or administer funds directly. 36% see that they should coordinate, whether that's connecting people to resources, but not actual direct disbursement of funds. Another 36% to partner and work with nonprofits or philanthropy to disperse the funds, and then 6% to wait, and depending on federal programs and guidance on that front. So this is really helpful to see, and it just, I think, shows the kind of varying roles that certain agencies have depending on where you are, and also your partnerships as well. So with that, we'll go on to the next slide, and we're going to go ahead and dive into the Q&A section, and we're going to go ahead and pull down the slide deck for a moment so you just see our faces as well. And as we wait for some audience questions to come in, I have one that I have on my mind, as I've seen this in past lives as well. And this is for both you, Brittany and Deanne. But I think a big obstacle that I had experienced is really how to make the case of investing in preparedness and resilience to leadership before that crisis hits. So we kind of made that case for the steps of what they need to do beforehand. But if somebody was to make a case to their leadership on, hey, we want to do a pre-position program, or we really want to start diving in to emergency planning, what would be some key points you would recommend them take with them out of this conversation?
Well, I could certainly start on that one. It's hard. I think it's really difficult to compete for funding for things that haven't happened yet. And I recognize that challenge. I had that challenge when I was in Aurora, Colorado, and I had that challenge even in New York City, right? It's hard to compete for that funding. But I think the more that you can demonstrate how the actions you're going to do today will pay off in the end, and what that return on investment is, and what the time saving is going to be important. But I think another key piece in trying to make that argument to get your leadership to listen to you is lives saved, right? How many lives are you going to save by doing this? And if you didn't do this, how are you going to answer these questions to the press? I think that one always helps get the attention of our executive leadership when you're giving them a question that they're going to have to figure out how to answer in the press because you didn't take some of these actions ahead of time. And you're going to have to make judgment calls sometimes, right? Because you have finite budgets and you have to be able to work within those budgets. And so it really is about creating that partnership and understanding how this isn't just something that's going to help just your agency, but how perhaps this preparedness or resilience action is going to have a wider impact across your entire community, across the entire, county structure, city structure, state structure. I think when you can show that it has benefit across multiple agencies, even though it may primarily impact yours, you have a better opportunity to try to get executive leadership to agree with that investment and move forward, even if it's only partially.
That is great insight and things I wish I knew a couple years ago myself, Deanne. Brittany, we have a question about AidKit prioritization here. So how does AidKit do prioritization of funds to individuals? And is there a team with local leadership? So feel free to go ahead and share the models from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you. And Jocelyn, I believe you also shared earlier that in Boulder, Colorado, you were able to get support with planning and you actually had an emergency manager embedded in your human services team. So I think that's wonderful. And it sounds like you all are way ahead of the game. Absolutely. On the question of local leadership, it's critical. We are experts in technology design and delivery and program operations, but no one is an expert in your community like you are and like the leaders in your own community. And so we have a saying at AidKit that we bend our technology to meet communities where they're at. We never ask communities to bend to meet where the technology is at. So that can take a couple different forms. We often see our partners developing community advisory councils, and we recommend that during the kind of setup phase for our pre-positioned contracting. So really looking to local leaders who represent different groups in your community, because you'll find that, and you know this already, your community-based organizations serve different pockets. And so you want to make sure that all those voices are heard, and you want to make sure that the eligibility criteria and the prioritization matrix is really going to maximize the impact for the investment. And so we have guides and templates, and we also leverage those kinds of groups for user testing to actually have real members of the community test the flows of the applications, see if the eligibility documentation we're asking for is reasonable, discover edge cases, and build new pathways to make sure that the programming is accessible to everybody. And yes, all of that has to be informed by local leadership. And that's something you don't always have time to do if you're being reactive, but you certainly have time to do if you're being proactive.
Awesome. Thank you, Brittany. And you also mentioned in that pre-positioned contracting, and going into that a bit more, there's another question in the chat of what are some lessons learned and pro tips that you would share on having contracts preset or pre-positioned to leverage during emergencies?
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things that you can do here is to really understand what it is you're looking for. If you personally haven't been involved in a prior disruption response, whether that was an emergency, a disaster, something like the pandemic, or maybe serving folks who are no longer able to access SNAP in your community, for instance, if you haven't been a part of that personally, you're going to want to go and talk to the people in your agency and other agencies who have, and kind of understand what some of those pain points were in advance. And you can do that. And you can also research platforms and partnerships like AidKit, and you can help kind of draft what a procurement might look like. What are you going to need when it is time to respond? What kind of partnership, what kind of technology and tools are you going to need? And again, yeah, it's best informed by those people who've actually lived it where you are, because you might learn that there was a flood of applications and there just wasn't enough capacity for the caseworkers to process all of those applications. That's something that we hear all the time. And in that case, you might want to have a pre-positioned contract that includes staffing so that you have that surge support and that additional capacity so that your regular programs are not disrupted and you can, not burn your staff out. Because that's one of the biggest concerns and things that I see is that our local and state teams teams are heroes. And when things happen, they stay up all night and they do everything they can and they burn themselves out and they find a way to deliver for their community. And if you're a leader in the space, you don't want your team to have to burn out. So, having something set up in place, informed by local leaders, that's attuned to your community, having that capacity waiting in the wings, is going to make all the difference.
And Jamie, I just want to add on to that too. When we talk about preposition contracts, you don't always have to have your own contract in place ahead of time too, especially if you're a smaller jurisdiction with a really small procurement office, even if you have a full procurement office, right? And so another activity that you can do ahead of time is understanding where jurisdictions that are close to you or your state agency has a contract that you can piggyback off of, right? Or that you can do together and you can put together a regional contract ahead of time, or a preposition type of contract ahead of time, right? So it doesn't have to be just your entity, just your community. And I think that's another really important step that we often forget, that you don't have to always have your own. If you do the research and understand a neighboring community, a big metro area that's next to you, do they have a clause in their contracts that allow you to use them? And if not, then work with them to see maybe if that's something that they would do, so you could utilize them if you needed to after a crisis happens.
That's a great point. I feel like kind of those jurisdiction borders sometimes are scary to cross, but going again into that partnership of not only across sectors and agencies, but with your neighboring counties, with your neighboring municipality, whatever that might be. So I want to dive into another question a bit more. And Deanne, from your side of being on emergency management, was there a common misconception you would see that emergency managers would have about human services, and how they can potentially unlearn that as well, and how human services can potentially be a part of helping them unlearn that?
I don't know if it's necessarily a common misconception. I think it's a matter of not understanding the work that they do day to day, right? And how they can take that work from a day-to-day operation and include it into the work that they're doing for their own preparedness planning. So I'll go back to the conversation about how our human service agencies already have this really valuable data of vulnerable people, vulnerable neighborhoods within their communities. Yet oftentimes I would see emergency management agencies trying to develop these registration databases if you have an access or functional need. And I'm not saying that those databases are bad or those opt-in programs are bad, but I think the more that we can combine that level of effort together, and so the person isn't getting hit by both the human service agency as well as emergency managers, it takes, again, that stress of multiple people reaching out to somebody, and you're utilizing the data that you have more efficiently. And so I think that it's not necessarily, again, a misconception about each other. It's a lack of understanding about how they can actually work together and bring the day-to-day work that they do into a unified effort to create a more holistic approach to how they're going to support their communities.
Wonderful. Super, super helpful. Thank you, Deanne. And I'm just going to take another pause for you all on the other side to potentially put in your questions. We have just under about 6 minutes left, so we'd love to hear from you. I'm going to sit in the awkward silence for a little bit to allow you all to type.
You can also put comments and experiences in the Q&A. We can stretch the Q&A name a little bit here.
Yes. Yeah. We'd love to hear, potentially what you've done on the ground, as well as you are the experts too. Maybe
the question to ask back is what do you wish emergency managers knew about what you do every day?
A couple comments as well. I wish there was even a little bit of funding for the HHS departments to do the planning. Yeah, I agree with that as well. Brittany and Deanne, do you have any kind of thoughts related to that comment?
I think one, again, this is again about the partnership, and Emergency managers struggle to get their own funding for planning, but they do get some funding for planning through different grants that are out there, whether it's a state grant or whether that's a federal grant. And so how do you maximize that funding that they're getting, even if it's a limited amount, by creating a more holistic approach and having the right people at the table to take on that effort together, right? And so learning what kind of funding is coming in across the city, the community, the county, and how do you create a multidisciplinary planning team instead of just a singular planning team.
Awesome. Very helpful. And it kind of goes into some other comments I'm seeing here too, of having a multi-agency feeding plan is very helpful during a state emergency operations center activation as well. And that it would be interesting to explore the ACF OHSEPR, which I believe is the Administration for Children and Families, Office of Human Services Emergency Preparedness and Response Emergency Framework as well. So those are, I think, helpful resources to look at when thinking about different planning dollars. And then one other question before we wrap up with the final one is related to fraud prevention. I know I hear a lot that fraud is one of the biggest concerns during an emergency of people taking advantage of the assistance out there. Are there any pro tips, Brittany and Deanne, from your side that you've seen from your experiences?
Yeah, so identity verification is huge for fraud prevention, and there's digital pathways. I think we're all familiar with tools like ID.me, and those can be very helpful in certain circumstances. At AidKit, what we've done is built our own identity verification that has multiple pathways, and we think that's really important. So when you're looking at fraud prevention, how do you make sure that people are who they say they are and that they're a unique individual? So context screening on the ground can be very helpful, especially when people don't have their identity documents after an immediate disaster, for instance. But then also being able to use one's phone to take a selfie and take a snap of their ID, and then being able to verify that way. And there's always edge cases. So being able to be flexible and being able to give the caseworkers the ability to work with someone and identify whether or not they believe they're a unique individual, and then allowing them to authorize that in the system. So it's really about options, and it's about kind of having a cascade of scrutiny.
Super helpful, Brittany. Thank you. And I want to prompt the deck to come up as we close out here. And thank you all for, your very valuable insights in the Q&A of the different frameworks. I know that's really helpful for us. Thank you for your time and participation, and thank you to APHSA for their partnership on this. But before we go, I do want to leave with one kind of final action item question for Brittany and Deanne. And what is one final thing you would want, even if you've already said it, anybody in the room to leave with to do in the next 30 days?
I think it just goes back to partnerships, right? There is nothing that we are going to face in the future, the increase in the threats, the intensity of the disasters, the number of people that are being impacted. We're just not going to be able to do it on our own. We're not going to be able to do it within our own agency. We're not going to be able to do it within our own city. And so those partnerships are so important, and they're going to become even more important as we see the landscape evolve.
I guess one thing that I would love to say is many of the comments in the chat have really pointed to, or in the Q&A rather, have really pointed to the shifting landscape around funding. And we know that funding sources are shifting, and that's really difficult. And we also understand that it can be hard, even in a place that's experienced many disasters, it can be hard to get that investment to be able to do the planning and preparedness work, and that you're all underwater with a million other things. HR 1, especially, I'm sure, is creating a lot of work. So the thing that I would say is that you should also, in addition to reaching across to your emergency managers, introducing yourselves, as Deanne said, also start speaking with your community-based organizations, maybe your large community foundation that you work with, or United Ways, and see if they can help bring philanthropic support to the table to be able to do some of this preparedness work and just kind of get things together. I know at AidKit, we're often working with multiple stakeholders to coordinate the technology systems across agencies and nonprofit partners. And if you can get a little bit of philanthropic investment up front to do the planning work, then you can often have these contracts in place at no cost until it's time to activate them. So it's really worth getting creative, and building those partnerships pays off huge in the long term.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I know I learned a lot today from all your wonderful insights and expertise, and I hope you all participating as well also learned a lot, and we love to hear from you. If you have any thoughts, questions, or need resources, we're here at AidKit to help support. And you can see on the screen here our email, partnerships@aidkit.cloud. But we're so thankful again for your time and joining. We know you're all busy, and thank you so much for the incredibly important work you do day in and day out for all the communities you're serving. So thank you, and thank you to APHSA as well.